Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the SPX Podcast, brought to you by the Steel Pipe Exchange, featuring Matt Manley and Brian DuBose.
Are we rolling?
We are rolling.
Nice.
Good deal. So, so something we've talked about before, I think, that we want to touch on a few things. One, grades of pipe. That's a big one that we do. And then just some maybe some best practice things, maybe a couple stories and some things to watch out for, something like that. Maybe you touch on some freight, because we haven't talked about freight really. Mm-hmm. Maybe we touch on that. So if you want to talk, you're really good about explaining the grades of pipe. So
sure.
You got a good thing about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important, and it's a sometimes sensitive topic. People have strong opinions. Some people have no opinions because they've never heard of it. But yeah, I think it needs to be talked about. I haven't seen any codification of grades. We codify ours. We've got the SPX grading method, and we try to educate our customers as best we can. I think this format might be better to do so because we're talking to our customers, we're talking to some suppliers, we're talking to people that aren't our customers but are in the industry. Most people are familiar with number one. I say most people because definitely not all. I mean, I could tell you a story real quick about a very recent misunderstanding on some number two grade. So recently, we sold a customer a load of number two. He says, I buy number two all the time. I've bought 60 loads this year. This was in late 2024. He tells us that he's bought 60 loads that year of number two pipe. We say, great. We still give him a little bit of context. Number two, probably going to have some flaking, some pitting, possible holes, possible IPC, possible bent joints. Since he says that he's bought a lot of it, we didn't give him the whole Miranda right, so to speak, of what number two is. He says he's comfortable, good to go. We sent him a load of pipe, number two, I think it was 2 3/8, and he flat out was ticked and rejected it and said, this is not what I paid for. This isn't even number two. This is like number 3 or maybe number 4. I'm like, okay, well, I don't know past number 2 what we're really talking about. So I get on the phone with him. This was one of our sales guys' customers, but he was so ticked at the sales guys that I got on the phone. I try not to always get involved, but in this case, he was so upset that I decided to get involved, see if I can't smooth it over and see what the heck happened. He says, I buy number 2 all the time. This isn't number 2. And I'm like, well, number 2, according to our grading metrics, is what we call all bets are off pipe. Possible holes, possible splits, possible IPC, could be gunk on the inside of the pipe. We've even seen it with some concrete on the inside. Not saying it's all going to happen, but there's certainly it's going to be rough. I mean, you're paying $10 a joint less for a reason. Why do you think that is? And he goes off on, well, I bought so much number 2. And I said, well, do you mind if I ask what you paid for that number 2 in the past? Because we sold it to him at, I believe, $35 a joint at the time. I think we're at $38 now because it's just harder to get. At the time we sold it for $35. He said, I've been paying $50, $55 a joint. Wow, that's quite a lot for number 2. Can I see some pictures? He sends me pictures, and this is number 1 pipe. And he's like, well, it's red band. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that it's number 2. And I said, can I ask who you've been buying this pipe from? And he says, well, I've been buying it from an oil company. I said, okay, I know exactly what's going on. You're buying it from an operator who's saying anything that grades structural, they're calling it number 2. So they're not doing number 1, number 1.5, and number 2 structural. They're saying anything structural is number 2. Oh yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Well, that's because they're an oil company. They're an operator. We are more of a structural supplier. And we did, tell you that there's these possible defects on this pipe. Well, yeah, but I just expected it was going to be really nice stuff. Well, okay, misunderstanding is now understood. I understand why you thought that. And here's what we're going to do to make it better. We don't need to get into all that for the purposes of this show. But that's perfect example of people not being educated on what number 1, number 2 is. He was buying number 1 pipe.
Yeah. So that's a good anecdote. That's a good story for just for some context, which is great. That's exactly. I remember when that happened. I think maybe we both talked to him.
Could be.
But yeah, that's really good. That's really good stuff. So I think it would help if we just kind of go through. Let's go through what the grades would be. So let's talk about number one. Now in number one, I know there's two different ways. There's number one, then there's number one brushed and cleaned. So that's a kind of a variation, which is a more premium structure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if I'm a customer and I'm asking what number one pipe is, what's your go-to response like to let me know what I'm buying for number one?
I tell them, no, we got a couple options. I ask them, what are they planning on doing? Are they going to paint the product? And if they say, well, what's number one? I tell them, it's the most premium quality of structural tubing. So number one, according to the SPX grading scale, is no holes, no splits, no IPC, and minimal, if any, pitting, and minimal, if any, flaking. There really should be no flaking, but used pipe, I always give a little bit of a wiggle room, so minimal flaking. Now, if you really, really want to paint your project, and it's got to be a more premium project, then we've got the option of going brushed and cleaned. Right now, I'm giving them the same price, but usually the reason why it's even more premium is you got a little bit more labor in it. You got to pay a little bit more to get it done. But what that brushing and cleaning does is it cleans the inside of the pipe, which typically doesn't matter very much to these guys. But they're brushing the outside of the pipe. So usually when you see brush and clean pipe, it's shiny, slick looking. You might see the swirl on the pipe. That's kind of that shows that it's been run through a cleaning machine. Now, if you get that material, what that does when it's brushed and cleaned is it actually makes it more susceptible to rust in the short term. So if you're going to get it brushed and cleaned, I always tell our customers, start painting it right away because you've got that clean surface. Go ahead and start painting it. But if you want to go with number one without the brushing and cleaning, you got a little bit of room. You usually have a little bit of residue left where it might even protect the surface for a little while longer. So it just depends on what the customer wants to do. But no holes, no splits, no IPC, certainly no concrete. Shouldn't be any gunk on the inside. Minimal, if any, pitting and minimal, if any, flaking. That's number one. And then the brushed and cleaned is going to be just that extra level of cleanliness. But it does open you up to, if it rains or if there's a lot of dew in the air, it might get that surface rust faster.
Yeah, and that's a good point is that, everybody wants, like we've had a lot of people that love the brushed and clean because when it gets there, it looks good. And it looks, like almost like it did when it was new, close to it, But rusting faster is a concern. And, if you're going to paint it and you want your paint to stick, painting over rust is not good. Now, there's things you can do to mitigate the rust on your pipe, but you can do that on stuff that's not brushed and cleaned also. But I think that's a really good thing to talk about is the difference of the brushed and clean versus the number one because it's the same pipe. It's just one looks better in the short term.
And if, there's another story a few months back where we had a customer that specifically wanted brushed and cleaned, but was keeping his eye on the weather. And sure enough, we were getting it out of, I think, Louisiana, and he's in Texas. And there was a big rainstorm that was happening, and he didn't want the pipe to come in and have to deal with muddy roads. Well, that's fine, but you also have to recognize that, like I said, the longer that pipe sits there, the less brushed and clean it's going to look. It's still going to look number one, but it's not going to look like brushed and clean when it arrives.
Yeah, it's brushed and it's cleaned, and then it sits until you're ready for it. Same as if you bought it brushed and cleaned right out of the cleaner, you buy it from there and you let it sit, it's gonna rust. It's steel, it's a ferrous metal. It's gonna rust.
Yep. So he was upset because it showed up and it was like, well, this is number one pipe, but it's not brushed and cleaned. Well, it was brushed and cleaned.
Right.
And this one was kind of extenuating circumstances. He let it sit on actually, we got it in West Texas and he was in East Texas. It sat at our testing facility for several weeks and actually the yard manager wanted us to get rid of it because we had to make room for more pipe. And he kept letting it sit. It had already been paid for, already been brushed. And finally it shows up and he was upset. And I had to explain to him, like, look, that is brushed and clean pipe. It went through the cleaning machine, but it sat on our racks for several weeks. Now, it didn't get rained on a ton because we were in West Texas, but he was upset. And
if that happens, if it gets run through the cleaner again, that costs money. There's labor involved. It costs more money, and it's unfortunate, but people don't work for free.
Right. Normal is like $3 to $7 a joint. For brushing and cleaning. Yeah. So we just couldn't do that for another load.
Right. And he's not going to want to pay for that, and I understand he doesn't want to pay for that. Right. But that's also something. It's a good story, a good precautionary tale, but it's also a good story about the steel pipe exchange, that he bought the pipe and we had the pipe and we didn't sell it out from under him. We had his pipe ready to go until he was ready, even though it was inconvenience to us and our testing facility, all that stuff. We still had his pipe and we still shipped it to him.
Right.
And
it worked out. We wound up. He decided to use that material for the stuff that he didn't care quite as much about, and then we were able to get him another load, freshly brushed and clean. I said, this time we're gonna, everybody's gonna watch the weather, make sure that we can get it done and get it to you right out of the machine. Basically, pull the cookies out of the oven and eat them while they're hot.
Yeah. And something to think about is if that happens, because the same thing happens with new pipe, brand new pipe. If it sits for too long, or if it gets rained on, or both, it's gonna rust. Now, it's surface rust. It's not impregnated into the new pipe, whereas this oil-filled pipe is, most of the rust is really set in just because it's been in the earth. Mm-hmm. But even new pipe, if you let it sit for a long time, it'll happen.
Yeah.
And it happens to the rolls, the hot rolls of steel, the coils, before they ever made into pipe. If they let them sit, they rust. Right. So that's just the nature of metal and steel. It's it's physics.
Yeah.
So that's good.
I'm not familiar with the science so much, but decoiled and new prime tubing, obviously they're going to be shinier when they get there and they're new.
Yeah.
But it seems like if you had a load of brushed and cleaned and a load of decoiled, a load of prime that came in at the same time, seems like that used pipe rusts a heck of a lot faster.
Yeah.
Not exactly sure what the science is on it, but the structural integrity is still strong.
Right.
Don't know why it is, just a visual thing.
Yeah. It's like I say, it's physics. It may be chemistry. I don't know. We'll say I'm not a metallurgist. I'm sure someone out there knows and can tell you exactly why and how. But that's good. It's like you said, you put those next to each other. The used pipe is going to rust a lot sooner. Then the decoiled probably after that, and then the new pipe's going to rust. Mm-hmm. But they're all going to rust at some point. There's ways you can mitigate it. Like on the new pipe, it goes through the when they make it, it's got oil on it, and that helps. The decoiled, sometimes it has oil on it, and that helps. The used pipe, it comes out and sometimes it'll have oil on it from just from pumping oil, but that's usually on the inside. Mm-hmm. So
sometimes it's got mud on it that protects it, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But
you just never know about that. Yeah. So that's good. That's number one, good stuff. And those are some examples of how there's been misunderstandings about what it is and all that stuff. So, and even the number two. But so if I was going to buy number two, like if I saw a steel pipe exchange ad, $38 for number two pipe, $38, a good price for pipe, but it's number two pipe. And we get the question a lot. What is number two pipe, and how would you explain what is number two pipe?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword when we let people know that we've got pipe at $38 and they're expecting number one, even if no matter how many times we put out there, number two pipe is $38, number one pipe is this. It's sometimes a tough conversation. People get frustrated, but the thing is it's quite a bit cheaper, and there's a reason it's quite a bit cheaper, and we have to let people know that. Now, if you're comfortable working around some defects, and you're comfortable with some stuff that's not as pretty, but if you just need something to get the job done, number 2 is a good option. Now, the grading that we use for number 2 pipe, of course, we say all bets are off because, that's what we mean. It could be they could be cut short. They could be short joints. They could be cut Dutchman, which means that when the pipe was connected and screwed together, instead of decoupling them, they just cut off
right after the joint.
So that's a possibility. Much heavier flaking possibility, much heavier pitting possibility. Could be some holes, could be some splits, could be bends. Now, bends happen naturally even in number 1 pipe, just from loading and unloading trucks. We try not to make it happen, trying to let it happen. If a customer gets quite a bit of it, we always try to make that right. But on the number 2 pipe, some of that stuff is just bent from being in a pile, unorganized. Now, on the flip side, you can get a load of number 2 pipe that is very, very good looking. You're not sure why it was graded number 2. Well, because maybe it was cut Dutchman, maybe because there were some testing holes, some pin holes. Maybe it was just a little bit pitted than we like, and we graded it number 2. That's possible. There are also possibilities where you get a load where quite a bit of it is ugly and flaky. And flaky pipe looks really bad, but if you send it through a cleaning machine, if you knock the rust off, sometimes you can get some really good pipe out of it. We've been moving a lot of number 2, 2 and 3/8 that's been very, very flaky. The reason it's very flaky is there was mud, there was just all kinds of different reasons, and it was sitting out on these racks baking in the West Texas sun. What that does when it gets wet and all that stuff and then it bakes is it just accelerates that flaking in scale, and the scale becomes the flakes. So what we do when, obviously we'd look at it and we say, okay, well, we can send that to go get brushed and cleaned, and maybe that's good. But if we look at it and we say that's not really worth getting brushed and cleaned, what we do is we put it on the truck, bring it to our yard, and we put our big JCB telehandler up, and we drop that pipe, and the pipe hits the ground, and a lot of that flaking comes off. So we basically just knock off the big pervasive flaking. But yeah, what I tell people is if you're comfortable working around holes, then what you can do is if you've got a joint where half the joint is just really, really good, take that half of the joint, use that for your rails or your posts or whatever. Then you've got your other half that's maybe got some holes or whatever, whatever. If you can get your measuring tape out and figure out the best way to slice up that half a joint of pipe, if you've got an 8-foot post and you've got a couple holes that are at the bottom of the post, sink that bottom of the post down in the ground with the holes in it, and the rest of your post is good. Then people that can work with splits, what they do is if they're building a fence and they're using a rail, you use that piece of the pipe with the split on it and you turn it down so that the water can drain through the split, and it actually works out even better because it doesn't hold that water in. And yeah, that's basically number 2, I guess, in a nutshell. Probably could go on and on and on, but that's number 2.
Yeah, I think that's good. What we tell people about number 2 is that, kind of like you said, all bets are off. It's possible that these are going to happen. Now we've been where we get our stuff out of. We've been pretty lucky about getting pretty good pipe, and it's kind of a gamble on what you're going to get.
Yeah.
Same as if you were to buy some pipe. If you're going to drive all the way out to a field and go get it, you don't know what it looks like till you get there. Typically. You can send pictures, but a lot of people will hide things in pictures,
right,
depending on what it is. And they do the same thing in trucks of number 2. They'll put all the good stuff around the bad stuff so you don't see it till you get it.
Right.
And those things can happen, but that's why, we try to be as transparent and open as we can about what you're buying. You know,
Yeah.
I don't want to sell somebody something and be like, oh, yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be great. Then they get it and it's not great.
Right. And I'm gonna hear about it afterwards. But
Right.
It comes back to what you said in a previous episode about mitigating your risk. And this industry is a lot about risk. If you're going to buy a load of number 2, obviously you want to know, you want to get your pictures, you want to ask what do you qualify as number 2. Now, if you're asking the SPX people or people that use the SPX grading scale, you kind of know what to expect. But you also need to know, what can I do to mitigate this load? So if I get a load of number 2 in, what I tell our dealers in particular, because they kind of deal with this as resellers, but also the fence builders need to know too. When you get your load of pipe in, when you unload it, just start unloading it in categories. If you've got, your quote unquote number 1 pile, you bought this whole load as number 2, but let's say you got some really good looking joints out of it. Put that in number 1 pile. If you got so maybe I digress a little bit and talk about what number 1.5 is for the sake of this conversation. Number 1.5, according to the SPX grading scale, is very close to number 1. Similar rules in terms of no holes, no splits, no IPC. What you are going to get, though, is a little bit more pervasive pitting and possibly a little bit more scale and flaking. We hope to not have much flaking and scale on a load of number 1.5, but it does happen, and we do leave a little bit of a tolerance for that in place, because you can get some really nice pipe with some just base flaking and scale on it. Stuff comes right off. So we leave a little bit of room on there for that. Now, back to mitigating the risk of a full truckload of number 2. You've got your number 1 pile. That means you've got some really good looking joints. Why were they graded number 2? Well, maybe the threads looked bad. Maybe it was cut Dutchman, but it's really good pipe. So you put that in your number 1 pile. Then you start a pile of number 1.5. When you're unloading the truck, you look at it, okay, that's a little bit rustier, a little bit more pitting, but it's still not number 2. I'm going to put that in the number 1.5 pile. Then you've got your number 2 pile, which is the stuff that you expect on a load number 2, stuff with holes, more pitting, more flaking, the stuff with IPC. Okay, if you got a few joints with IPC, but it's really good OD, outside diameter is nice and pretty for the most part, then you might say, okay, that's why they graded it number 2, but I can cut that into post, or I can use that. So set that off to the side in your kind of number 2 category range over here. Then you've got the stuff that's just really, really ugly. Or maybe you've got some stuff that half the joint is great, but half the joint is just corroded to all get out. Cut the bad half off, and then you start your scrap pile. So when you're using the stuff in the pile of number 2, you're cutting posts out of it, you're cutting rails out of it, you're using what you can, but you're getting rid of what you can't. Put all the stuff you can't use in your scrap pile. Once you've got a good enough scrap pile, you take that to the scrap yard and you get paid for it. You're going to make pennies on the dollar, but you're going to get something. The stuff that you've got that you're able to use for posts or for rails or whatever, you're going to try to make what you can out of it. Now for us, when we buy some number 2 and we're able to cut posts out of it, we're using the posts that we can call number 1. If we've got a number 2 joint, a 31.5 foot average length of number 2 pipe, but we're able to cut 1 8-foot length out of it, that's good. We're going to call that a number 1 post. Then we're going to have this rest of it that's kind of rough. Okay, well, we can maybe sell that as a rail material. And that way we can kind of get our money out of it. Then the number 1.5 and the number 1, we're just going to use that and sell that as number 1. That's how you kind of mitigate your risk on a truckload of number 2.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice of kind of how to mitigate that risk, how to do what you can with what you got. When you're talking about used pipe, there's going to be a lot of that. You're just doing what you can with what you got, and I think that's really good. And like Matt said, is we've got there's times where it's just not right. And us as the Steel Pipe Exchange and our people, we try to make it right. You buy some good pipe. You buy number 1, shows up number 2. We're going to do what we can to make it right for you. You buy number 1.5. We're going to do we're going to do what we can.
It's got a bunch of holes in some number 1.5 that you bought. It's not supposed to, so we're going to make that right.
Right, exactly. So I think that's a good, that's good information. That's really good. I think that's a good place to leave it.
Sounds good.
All righty. We'll see y'all next time.